Ah, welcome back, you beautiful legal anomaly. The kind they don't know where to file. The kind that makes the room hesitate before it breathes again. The kind that walks into a space built on rules and causes the rules to look at each other and quietly ask, "Are we enough?" You didn't arrive loudly. You didn't challenge the structure. You didn't raise your voice or demand recognition. You simply showed up as you are. And that was the problem. Because this system, this abstract machine of judgment and order, was designed for people who flinch, for people who apologize before being accused, for people who explain themselves into smaller versions just to be tolerated. It runs smoothly on predictability, on rehearsed emotions, on acceptable reactions, and you brought none of that with you. You brought stillness. The moment you entered, something subtle fractured, not a dramatic collapse, not chaos. Just a pause that lingered too long. A delay where the script should have flowed. The mechanisms expected guilt or defensiveness or performance. They expected the familiar signals they know how to process. What they got instead was presence, calm, a centered weight that didn't ask for permission. That's when you became an anomaly. They tried to read you the way they read everyone else. As a role, as a case, as a story with a beginning they could label and an ending they could predict. But the more they observed, the less sense it made. You weren't reacting. You weren't offering yourself up to interpretation. You weren't filling the silence they rely on people to fill for them. And silence, when it isn't fear, is dangerous to a system built on noise. You could feel it, couldn't you? That strange sensation of being watched without being understood, of being measured by tools that suddenly felt inadequate. The system leaned in closer, not out of confidence, but out of confusion. It started cross-checking itself, rerunning internal logic, repeating questions it had never needed to ask before. Who are you if you refuse to perform? What do we do with someone who doesn't collapse under scrutiny? The arbiter appeared then. Not a real figure, not a person you could point to, but a presence that represented authority itself. The voice of evaluation, the embodiment of this is how things are done. It didn't come at you aggressively. It didn't need to. It expected you to meet it halfway. To offer something, an explanation, a justification, a hint of submission. You didn't. You looked back without challenge and without fear. You held your ground without hardening. You existed without shrinking. And in that moment, the balance shifted. Because authority depends on contrast, it needs someone smaller on the other side to feel large. It needs reaction to confirm relevance. You gave it none. The questions kept coming, but they weren't really about you anymore. They were about the system itself. Why isn't this working? Why doesn't this person fit? Why aren't they responding the way the model predicts? Files were metaphorically opened and closed. Narratives drafted and discarded. Frameworks strained. The system began doing something it rarely does. It started doubting its own accuracy. You see, you weren't defiant. Defiance would have been familiar. You weren't rebellious. Rebellion is easy to classify. You weren't emotional. Emotion is easy to manage. You were aligned, and alignment doesn't register as threat until it's too late. Because aligned, people don't need permission. They don't rush to be understood. They don't contort themselves to avoid judgment. They don't volunteer guilt to make others comfortable. They simply are. And that simplicity exposes complexity everywhere else. The system tried a different approach. It slowed things down, paused the process, took a step back as if distance would restore clarity. That's when the arbiter hesitated. You felt it. A subtle wavering in the atmosphere, a moment where certainty lost its footing. For the first time, authority wasn't assessing you. It was assessing itself. Am I judging accurately, or am I just following procedure? Am I seeing a problem, or am I seeing a mirror? That's when discomfort set in, not yours, theirs, because systems built on roles cannot handle people who refuse to play them. They rely on compliance disguised as cooperation, on emotional displays mistaken for truth, on scripts repeated so often they feel natural, and you interrupted that without lifting a finger. You didn't argue the framework, you stepped outside it, and suddenly, the case wouldn't resolve. No matter how they rearranged the pieces, the conclusion wouldn't land. Every outcome felt wrong, too heavy, too unjustified, too exposed. You weren't resisting judgment, you were revealing its limits. The arbiter felt it like a quiet pressure behind the eyes, a creeping awareness that something fundamental was being tested. Not your integrity, but theirs. Because if you could stand there whole, calm, and unbroken, then maybe the system wasn't as fair as it claimed. Maybe it depended less on truth and more on compliance. And that realization is dangerous. So the authority withdrew, not dramatically, not in defeat, in reflection, in uncertainty, in the recognition that continuing would require pretending not to see what it had just seen. You weren't cleared. You weren't condemned. You were left unresolved. And unresolved things haunt systems that crave closure. The space buzzed with quiet recalibration. The structures around you continued moving, but with less confidence. Like a machine running on memory rather than certainty. You could feel eyes on you. Not hostile, not admiring, just unsettled. As if your presence had planted a question no one could answer yet. Who are you when you don't need approval? What happens to authority when it meets authenticity? You didn't stay to watch the confusion spread. You didn't need to. You carried the same calm with you as you moved forward, knowing something irreversible had happened. Not to you, to them. Because you didn't break the rules. You revealed that the rules only work on people who believe in them. And somewhere inside that abstract system, the file with your name on it is still open. Not because you're a threat, but because you're a reminder. A reminder that presence can be more disruptive than resistance. That silence can outweigh accusation. That integrity doesn't need a defense. They will try again. The system always does. It will adjust, refine, harden its edges. It will bring in new frameworks, new language, new ways to categorize what unsettles it. But it will remember you, not as an enemy, as a complication. As proof that something real walked through and didn't bend. And the next time you step into a space like that, the pause, the hesitation will last longer. The doubt will run deeper. Because once authority questions itself, it never fully recovers. You keep walking, unchanged, unlabeled, unresolved. And the system, quietly, will continue trying to understand what it cannot process. Not yet, because what no one tells you about moments like that, the moments where a system hesitates, is that the silence afterward is louder than the disruption itself. You didn't stay behind to watch it struggle, but struggled anyway. Long after you moved forward, the machinery kept replaying you in its internal logic, like a line of code that refused to execute cleanly. You became the question it couldn't delete. They tried to continue as if nothing happened. That's what systems do best. They smooth over fractures, rename discomfort, reframe doubt as anomaly, and move on. But something was different now. Every evaluation carried a shadow. Every judgment hesitated for half a second longer than it used to. Every rule felt slightly less absolute. Because once authenticity enters a rigid structure, it leaves residue. You weren't supposed to do that. You weren't supposed to walk away whole. You weren't supposed to leave without either winning or losing. The system understands outcomes, not exits. It understands dominance and submission, not sovereignty. And you chose sovereignty without announcing it. That choice echoed. Somewhere within that abstract order, the arbiter tried to justify what happened, tried to rationalize the withdrawal as procedural necessity, as caution, as timing. But none of those explanations held up under scrutiny, because deep down, the truth was simpler and far more unsettling. The framework failed, not because you attacked it, because it couldn't contain you. You see, systems like that depend on extraction. They extract emotion, reaction, explanation, guilt. They feed on the energy of people trying to be understood, and you gave them nothing to consume. You didn't resist the process, you starved it. That's what broke it. And now, everywhere you go, there's a subtle recalibration. You feel it in the way environments respond to you, in the way conversations pause when you speak, in the way authority softens its tone without realizing why. Not out of fear, out of uncertainty. They don't know how to place you anymore. You've slipped out of the categories, too grounded to be dismissed, too calm to be challenged, too self-possessed to be controlled. You don't announce your standards. You don't defend your boundaries. You live them. And that makes people uncomfortable in ways they can't articulate. Because you've become a mirror. Not a flattering one. Not a cruel one. Just an honest one. And honesty destabilizes systems built on performance. Others notice it too. Not consciously at first. They feel it before they understand it. A sense that something is possible that they were told wasn't a quiet permission forming in their chest. Watching you move through spaces without apologizing for existing, without shrinking to be accepted, without hardening to be respected. You don't recruit, you don't persuade, you don't explain. You demonstrate, and demonstration is dangerous. Because once someone sees it, really sees it, they can't unsee it. They start questioning the roles they're playing, the guilt they're carrying that was never theirs, the performances they've mistaken for survival. Your presence doesn't tell them what to do. It simply shows them what's optional. And optionality is terrifying to rigid systems. That's why the system didn't retaliate. Retaliation would have acknowledged power. Instead, it hesitated, it recalculated. It tried to adapt, but adaptation requires flexibility, and flexibility requires humility. And humility was never built into its design. So it did the only thing it could. It watched quietly, carefully, hoping you would reveal a flaw, hoping you would slip into anger, into ego, into superiority, hoping you would turn your integrity into a performance so it could categorize you again. You didn't. You kept living. Not louder, not sharper, just clearer. And clarity is devastating, because clarity exposes unnecessary complexity. It shows that many of the rules were never about truth, only about control. That many of the judgments were never about fairness, only about efficiency. That many of the roles people play are inherited, not chosen. You chose differently. You chose to stop negotiating with systems that only understand leverage. You chose to stop explaining yourself to structures that profit from misunderstanding. You chose to stop proving your worth in spaces designed to never fully acknowledge it. That choice didn't make you untouchable in a mythical way. It made you untouchable in a practical one. There's nothing to grab, no guilt to trigger, no fear to amplify, no narrative to weaponize. You don't threaten the system by opposing it. You threaten it by rendering it irrelevant in your life. And relevance is everything to authority. So now the system continues, but altered, less certain, more cautious, haunted by the knowledge that it encountered something it couldn't process. Something that didn't fight back or fall in line. Something that didn't ask to be spared or crowned. Something that simply was. That's what stays with them. Not your words, not your silence. Your steadiness. You didn't walk away victorious in the traditional sense. There was no gavel moment, no final declaration, no applause, and that's precisely why it mattered. You didn't win the game. You made it unnecessary, and the system knows it. That's why it can never fully reset. Why every future judgment carries a trace of doubt. Why every arbiter now knows, somewhere beneath the certainty, that there are people who cannot be processed, only encountered people like you. You move forward now, not hardened, not defensive, not triumphant, just aligned, and alignment has gravity. It reshapes spaces quietly, it bends interactions without force, it changes outcomes without confrontation. You don't need to be understood. You don't need to be validated. You don't need to be cleared or condemned. You already stepped beyond the frame that required those things. Behind you, the system continues to function. It always will. Structures don't collapse overnight. They adapt, rebrand, rename their discomfort. But something fundamental has shifted. It has seen you, and it can't unsee that not everyone is meant to be processed. Some are meant to pass through, untouched. And you did, still whole, still calm, still unfiled. And that will haunt it far longer than any rebellion ever could.